You wake up, you make your coffee, and then, somewhere in the first hour of your morning, you eat something. Perhaps it is cereal, perhaps it is toast. Perhaps it is a piece of fruit, or a yogurt, or the same thing you have been eating on weekday mornings for the past 20 years without giving it a second thought. That first meal of the day, the one you eat while still half asleep, while scrolling through your phone or watching the morning news, while your body is just beginning to make the transition from overnight rest to the demands of the day, is not a neutral event for your blood glucose. It is one of the most metabolically consequential decisions you make in the entire 24-hour cycle. And most people over 60 are making it on autopilot, with no awareness of what their breakfast is doing to their blood sugar for the next 4 to 6 hours. Here is what most people do not know. The first meal of the day sets the metabolic tone for everything that follows. The blood sugar response to your breakfast determines how hungry you will be at mid-morning. It determines whether you will experience the brain fog and energy crash that sends many older adults to the biscuit tin by 10 o'clock. It influences your blood sugar response to your lunch, your afternoon snack, and even your dinner. Research on what scientists call the second meal effect has documented that the composition of your breakfast influences the glucose spike produced by your next meal hours later. Your first food choice reverberates through the entire metabolic day. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly what your breakfast is doing to your blood sugar, which breakfast foods are the most damaging for older adults managing glucose regulation, and which specific choices turn the first meal of the day into a metabolic protection tool rather than a metabolic stressor. The changes I am going to suggest are not extreme. They are not a diet overhaul. They are specific, targeted adjustments to a meal you are already eating that can change your blood sugar trajectory starting tomorrow morning. My name is Dr. Favor Clinton. I have over 10 years of clinical experience, and breakfast composition in the context of blood glucose management is one of the most immediately actionable nutritional conversations I have with patients. The information in this video is practical, evidence-based, and applicable starting with your breakfast tomorrow. Let us go through it. To understand why breakfast composition matters so much more than any other meal for blood glucose management, you need to understand what your metabolic system is doing in the morning hours and why it responds to food differently at 7 in the morning than it does at noon. The morning cortisol surge, which we have discussed extensively in the context of cardiovascular health, also has direct metabolic consequences. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone. One of its primary functions is to raise blood glucose in preparation for the demands of waking activity. It does this by stimulating the liver to release glucose from its glycogen stores and by reducing insulin sensitivity in the peripheral tissues. The result is that by the time you sit down to breakfast, your blood glucose is already slightly elevated, and your cells are already slightly insulin resistant from the overnight cortisol rise. This morning insulin resistance, sometimes called the dawn phenomenon, means that the same food eaten for breakfast produces a higher and more prolonged blood glucose spike than the identical food eaten later in the day. Your pancreas has to work harder. More insulin must be produced to achieve the same blood glucose clearance. And in a person who is already on the spectrum of insulin resistance, the pancreas may not be able to produce enough insulin to bring the post-breakfast spike down efficiently, leaving blood glucose elevated for hours after the meal. There is a second factor. After 7 or 8 hours without food, your liver has been slowly releasing glucose into the bloodstream to maintain overnight glucose levels. By the time you wake up, the first food you eat encounters an insulin response that is already primed for glucose management, but that is working against the background of the dawn phenomenon's insulin resistance. The composition of that first food determines whether you are asking your metabolic system to manage a manageable glucose load or an overwhelming one. The third factor is the second meal effect. Research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and replicated in subsequent studies has found that the blood glucose response to lunch is significantly influenced by what was eaten at breakfast. A breakfast that produces a low, slow glucose rise and sustained satiety results in a blunted glucose spike at lunchtime, even when lunch itself is identical between groups. A breakfast that produces a rapid, high glucose spike and early return of hunger results in an exaggerated glucose spike at lunch. The mechanism involves the fermentation of dietary fiber by gut bacteria at breakfast, producing short-chain fatty acids that modulate the glucose response at subsequent meals. Your breakfast is not just affecting the next 2 hours, it is affecting the next 8. I want to tell you about a patient I will call Celeste. Celeste was 61 years old when she came to see me following the HbA1c result that had moved her from the normal range into the pre-diabetes range at her most recent annual health check. Her GP had given her a leaflet about diabetes prevention and advised her to reduce sugar and exercise more. She had followed that advice dutifully for 3 months and had returned to find her HbA1c unchanged. She was frustrated and confused. She had genuinely reduced her sugar intake. She had been walking for 30 minutes every day, something she had not been doing before. She was doing the things she had been told to do, and nothing had changed. When I asked Celeste to describe her typical day of eating in precise detail, starting from the moment she woke up, what she described in the first hour was a metabolic disaster in slow motion. She began every day with a large glass of commercial orange juice, which she had been drinking for 30 years because she believed it was healthy. She followed it with 2 slices of white toast with a thin scraping of low-fat spread and a teaspoon of honey, which she had substituted for jam in the belief that honey was a healthier sweetener. And she finished with a small pot of low-fat fruit yogurt, which she had chosen specifically because it was labeled low-fat, and she associated low-fat with health. Her breakfast, which she genuinely believed was a responsible health choice, contained approximately 75 grams of rapidly absorbed carbohydrate with virtually no protein, no fat, and minimal fiber. It was producing a blood glucose spike every morning that was among the highest of her entire day, driving her HbA1c upward despite every other improvement she had made. The sugar reduction her GP had advised had been implemented everywhere in her diet except the one meal that was producing the most metabolic damage. We redesigned her breakfast entirely around the principles I am about to share with you. Her next HbA1c, 3 months later, had dropped from 6.1 to 5.8. Not dramatic, but directionally significant. Her mid-morning hunger and energy crashes had disappeared entirely within the first 2 weeks. She told me at her follow-up that changing her breakfast felt like it had changed her entire relationship with food for the rest of the day. She understood why now. The second meal effect was visible in her own daily experience before any blood test confirmed it. Before I give you the best choices, I want to be specific about the worst ones, because several of them, like Celeste's breakfast, carry a health halo that makes them deeply counterintuitive as harmful choices without the metabolic context I am about to provide. Commercial fruit juice is first. A glass of commercial orange, apple, or grape juice contains between 25 and 35 grams of fructose and glucose in a rapidly absorbed liquid form with no fiber to slow its entry into the bloodstream. It produces one of the fastest and highest blood glucose spikes of any food or drink available. The fruit it came from, eaten whole, would have produced a fraction of that spike because the fiber in the whole fruit dramatically slows sugar absorption. Processing removes the fiber and concentrates the sugar into a format that the gut absorbs within minutes. Celeste's morning orange juice was producing a blood glucose spike before she had finished her toast. Low-fat flavored yogurt is second. The low-fat label on flavored yogurt is one of the most consistently misleading in the food industry. To compensate for the reduced palatability of removing fat, most low-fat flavored yogurts add significant quantities of sugar, often between 15 and 20 grams per small pot. Fat slows gastric emptying and reduces the speed of carbohydrate absorption. Removing the fat and replacing it with sugar produces a product that absorbs faster and spikes blood glucose more steeply than full-fat plain yogurt would. Most commercial breakfast cereals are third, including many marketed as healthy, high-fiber, or whole grain. The processing involved in producing most breakfast cereals, regardless of their starting ingredients, significantly increases the glycemic index of the final product compared to the unprocessed grain. Puffed, extruded, flaked, and toasted cereals typically produce rapid and steep blood glucose spikes, even when they are labeled as whole grain or high fiber. The exceptions are oats in their minimally processed forms, which I will return to. White bread, white bagels, white English muffins, and other refined grain breakfast staples are fourth. Refined grain products have had their fiber and most of their micronutrients removed in processing, leaving a rapidly digestible starch that behaves similarly to table sugar in terms of blood glucose impact. Combined with the morning insulin resistance of the dawn phenomenon, refined grain breakfasts are among the most glucose destabilizing food choices available. Honey, agave, and other natural sweeteners used in the belief that they are healthier than sugar are fifth. While the fructose content of some natural sweeteners differs from refined sugar in ways that affect liver metabolism, from the perspective of blood glucose response, they behave similarly. Honey produces a blood glucose spike that is virtually identical to that of table sugar. The health halo around natural sweeteners is one of the most persistent and most metabolically costly misconceptions in nutrition. The breakfast composition principles that most powerfully stabilize blood glucose in older adults with insulin resistance or prediabetes converge on three nutritional priorities: protein at the start of the meal, fiber to slow glucose absorption, and the deliberate reduction of rapidly absorbed carbohydrates at breakfast specifically because of the dawn phenomenon's amplifying effect on morning glucose spikes. Eggs in any form are the gold standard morning protein choice for blood glucose management. A large egg contains approximately 6 grams of complete protein, 5 grams of fat, including beneficial fatty acids, and essentially zero carbohydrate. The protein and fat content of eggs slows gastric emptying, moderates glucose absorption from any carbohydrate eaten alongside them, and produces a satiety response that keeps hunger at bay well into the mid-morning, preventing the snacking that drives additional glucose spikes. Research published in the journal Nutrients has specifically found that eating eggs at breakfast reduces post-meal glucose and insulin levels compared to a calorie-matched cereal breakfast in adults with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. The second meal effect of an egg breakfast extends the glucose stabilizing benefit through lunch, reducing the post-lunch spike as well as the post-breakfast one. For Celeste, replacing her juice and toast breakfast with 2 eggs in any preparation she enjoyed, scrambled, poached, or boiled, was the single most impactful change in her entire dietary revision. Greek yogurt, plain and full fat, is the second best protein breakfast choice for blood glucose management. Full-fat plain Greek yogurt contains approximately 17 to 20 grams of protein per standard serving, with a glycemic index that is significantly lower than low-fat flavored varieties. The protein content, combined with the natural fat and the probiotic bacteria that influence gut fermentation and subsequent glucose response, makes full-fat plain Greek yogurt one of the most evidence-supported breakfast choices for blood glucose stability available. Steel-cut or rolled oats are the best carbohydrate choice for breakfast in the context of blood glucose management, but with a specific preparation caveat. The intact, minimally processed structure of steel-cut and rolled oats means that the starch they contain is released slowly during digestion, producing a gradual and modest glucose rise, rather than the spike produced by processed cereals or refined grain products. The beta-glucan fiber in oats specifically has been shown to reduce post-meal glucose response and improve insulin sensitivity over time. However, oats must be prepared without added sugar and ideally combined with protein, such as a spoonful of nut butter or a side of eggs, to maximize their glucose-stabilizing properties. Beyond composition, there is a sequence principle that research has recently identified as having a significant independent effect on post-meal glucose response. The order in which you eat the components of your breakfast affects the glucose spike that breakfast produces, even when the total caloric and macronutrient composition is identical. Research published in Diabetes Care found that eating vegetables and protein before carbohydrates at a meal reduced the post-meal glucose spike by approximately 30 to 40% compared to eating the same foods in the reverse order. The mechanism is mechanical and enzymatic. Protein and fiber eaten first form a physical barrier in the stomach that slows the emptying of carbohydrates into the small intestine, where glucose is absorbed. They also stimulate the release of GLP-1, an incretin hormone that modulates insulin release and slows gastric emptying before the carbohydrate arrives. In practical terms, this means that if your breakfast includes both eggs and toast, eating the eggs before the toast rather than alternating bites reduces the glucose impact of the toast. If your breakfast includes yogurt and fruit, eating the yogurt first and the fruit second reduces the glucose impact of the fruit's sugar. The sequence takes no additional time, costs no additional money, and requires no change in the foods themselves, only the order in which they are consumed. This principle extends to drinks. If you are going to have a glass of water with lemon, which, as we discussed in an earlier video, contains citrate that supports kidney health and alkalizes the urine, drinking it before you begin eating rather than alongside food maximizes the satiety signal it provides and supports the gastric environment that slows subsequent glucose absorption. Let me bring this together into a complete morning blood sugar protection approach that starts from the moment you wake up and carries you through to your mid-morning with glucose stability that most people in their 60s have never experienced on a consistent basis. Before breakfast, drink your glass of warm lemon water and then a full glass of plain water. This rehydrates your blood, provides citrate to the kidneys at their most concentrated morning state, and begins reducing the blood viscosity that morning dehydration produces. It also moderates the appetite signal that arrives after overnight fasting, preventing the urgency-driven carbohydrate choices that many people make when they sit down to breakfast very hungry. For breakfast itself, the core principle is protein first and dominant, carbohydrates minimal, and fiber rich if included at all. 2 eggs in any preparation is the simplest and most effective anchor. Full-fat plain Greek yogurt with a handful of berries and a tablespoon of nut butter provides a different but equally well-structured alternative. Steel-cut oats with a side of eggs or a tablespoon of protein-rich nut butter provides the third option for those who prefer a warm, carbohydrate-based breakfast without the glucose destabilization that most cereal-based options produce. The foods to specifically move away from at breakfast are commercial fruit juice, low-fat flavored yogurt, sweetened cereals, and white bread or refined grain products. Not because they are forbidden, because their glucose impact is amplified by the morning dawn phenomenon in a way that affects the entire metabolic day, and because the alternatives provide equivalent satisfaction without that amplification. If you make only one change from this video, let it be the elimination of commercial fruit juice at breakfast. Replace it with water, with warm lemon water, or with plain full-fat yogurt with whole berries if you want the fruit component. That single substitution removes one of the most glucose-destabilizing elements of the typical older adult breakfast and replaces it with something that either has no glucose impact at all or that moderates rather than amplifies the post-meal response. I want to hear from you in the comments right now. What does your typical breakfast look like? And after watching this video, can you identify the element of your current breakfast that is most likely driving a blood sugar spike you have been unaware of? Write it in the comments. I read every one, and the answers consistently reveal the specific foods and habits that need the most targeted attention in this community. If this video gave you a practical, specific, immediately actionable change to make to a meal you eat every single morning, please share it. Share it with the person in your life who starts their day with a glass of orange juice and a bowl of cereal and has been wondering why they feel exhausted by 10 o'clock. That share may be the most practical health gift you give them this year. Subscribe for more honest, research-grounded conversations about metabolic health and blood sugar protection after 60. Next time, we are going to talk about 5 drinks that spike your blood sugar before noon and the 3 that protect it. That video is the direct follow-up to today and gives you the complete liquid picture of your daily glucose management from morning to mid-afternoon.